and we will begin. All right, so the previous chapters that we've been talking about or you've been seeing are all of the basic setups on how we go about starting and creating a business or a product. And so what this does is it helps us to understand that all of these things as they're being done are not being done in a vacuum. Quite simply, what we must understand is we live in a world in which we are always going to have competition. One of the things or difficulties that organizations don't understand is that even when they have unique products, somebody is out there trying to beat them. In 2008, Microsoft owned 90% of all of the software platforms in the world. In other words, the operating systems themselves. They achieved a dominance for 20 years that just seemed indestructible. And yet 5 years after that, they had only 1/3 of the entire market, and that's the way they have maintained. So what stopped Microsoft? What was the big products that took Microsoft away from such domination? Happened around 2009. Good start, but even more so something else. But keep thinking of those lines. Smartphones, all right? In 2009, when I first taught this class, I just had like a razor or whatever, and I asked all of my students who has a smartphone, and everybody did, all right? And at that point, I suddenly realized something had happened that I had missed it. And if we look at where mobile technology has taken us, and then if I also put iPads and iPhones out there as well, we have fundamentally changed the structure in which we use all operating systems to begin with. And because those things came along, Microsoft lost its dominance and never got it back. And those weren't direct competitors. They were we would consider to be generic competitors. They were working on a different platform, and Microsoft just simply failed to take advantage of that. I'm going to show you maybe tomorrow a product that Microsoft had that was coming out 6 months before the iPad that would have ultimately predated touch screens and touchpad technology by about 6 months, and they failed to release it. So the whole point of this thing about addressing competition and driving growth, one of my favorite sayings is, if you're not trying to put yourself out of business, somebody else is, okay? So how do we grow our markets? Because if we're not growing, we're dying. And that's the simple statement, all right? If you're not growing, you're dying. And so some of the strategies that we're going to be talking about are all wrapped around these particular things. And some of them have to do with very simple things. In other words, that don't require large strategies, which is quite simply growing your market share by finding some way of penetrating and selling more, maybe getting into acquisitions and mergers with other corporations. But some of them require depth, which is innovations into new products, into new services and experiences. And this, I would say, I appreciate Apple as a brand. I appreciate the goods that they have, but I've never drank the Apple Kool-Aid. So I can look at them from a disparate view. And one of the things that Apple has always been is their innovation is just absolutely outstanding, all right? But even saying that, there's certain caveats in the way that they live their lives that they refuse to break out of. And so it is important once you start to be able to grow and to continue to grow. So what are some of the ways that we go about doing this? Well, the first one is that we want to make our brand as distinct and unique as possible. If I'm looking at the brand's Apple and I'm looking at the brand Lenovo, you have a unique, special place identifying in those particular areas in their mind that are so unique that are not necessarily specialized in any way. And yet, in your apples right now, you have something to around 80 to 85% of the same chips that are being used currently right now in PC compatible systems. You can run Windows native on an Apple machine because in 2008, Steve Jobs made an amazing, to me, admission, for the lack of a better word, is that Apple would no longer use their own chips for CPU processing, but would go to the Intel chips, which meant that instead of having to run PC in a software environment using soft PC or any of the others, you could actually run it natively on an Apple. Yet, having said that, no self-respecting Apple person would ever want to run that on it, but if you wanted to, you could, all right? Another one, quite simply, is a penetration strategy where you try to drive distribution through both new existing channels and some new ones. Folks, I taught channels, and in 2009, I wanted to do channels of distribution as my specialty. You do that in PhD. People want to do consumer behavior, everybody, consumer behavior. I wanted to do channels. I couldn't find a supply chain in at Louisiana Tech, but I still maintain that channels was my thing, where it seemed like everybody was laughing me off. Now my channels classes, I have 3 channel sections, and they're all stacked. Why? Because this little device came along and changed everything, and it brought to us what's known as the omni-channel, and changed forever how we go about ordering and receiving goods, all from this little device. And so when it comes to driving distribution through new and existing channels, the omni-channel changed the game for everyone, all right? And then finally, what we can do is we can take an existing product and we can create something new or unique or different with it. And that slight variation can improve things. So one of the things I talk about when WD-40 came out, WD-40 was a spray, and it did well for years and years and years. And apparently Einstein came up with the idea of putting a little drinking straw that you could connect, and that doubled sales in WD-40. So just a slight change ultimately can make major differences, okay? So one of the things, if you look at most markets tend to be related in certain strata, all right? And so if I were going to look at marketing, or let's just say businesses, what you generally find is that, you hate to make generic statements, but marketing is basically, our markets are split up into generally 4 categories, okay? And you're going to get bit by saying this, but generally, the reasons that we study these things, and let me also tell you this, and a lot of the experiences with this is that with businesses and industry, things move so fast, all right, that many times to see strata as this is not always perfect. But why do we teach it? Well, because it's useful. It allows us to be able to grab an idea of what industries are and how they relate. The leaders and the challengers and the followers and the nichers, they exchange places constantly, all right? That's the nature of competition and growth. But what this hopefully does is it gives you an idea. We're going to talk about that each one of these groups, the market leaders, the market challengers, the market followers, and the market nichers, each have their own unique strategy for being able to maintain their positions and be able to expand. And so there's 3 things in any kind of strategy that you want to do. You want to expand the total market demand. All right, what does that mean? It means this is that this whole market here, all right, this whole market, we want to take this whole market And as a market leader, we want to expand it. Because even if we have that 40% market share and we expand that, oh, it's going to clean up there. They haven't cleaned that way. Anyway, so if you notice, this 40% here is now 40% here, and the whole market has expanded and made the entire market more reliable. And so the classic example of this is that when there are generic kind of strategies that say, eat more than one banana a day, all right? That would be an example of expanding an overall market. But if my name is Dole, it means that my area is going to expand more than others, all right? So this is an example of how that works, okay? The next is we protect market share. And what we try to do, especially in times of difficulty, is we try to wall this off and maintain this 40% come heck or high water. Which means that we have to anticipate competitors coming in there and creating difficulties for us. And then the last thing we want to be able to do is increase our market share as well. Now, the market share is this 40 here would go to a 45%. And generally what you see this in terms of a strategy is if we're in a market that has stagnated or is having lower demand. And so ultimately what we have here is a way or ideas for going about expanding our total market. So as I talked about in expanding total market demand, we have two ways that we can go about doing that. One is through new customers, and another is through some kind of new unique usage. So Monroe came up with this idea in the 70s that they were going to say that along with changing your oil every 5,000 miles, you need to change your shocks every 50,000. And so that needed to be something that would happen in the daily, grind of doing your standard kind of maintenance. So if you think of anything like that, make sure you change, your baking soda twice a year in your refrigerator. That would be an example of that as well. The new customers basically is to take an existing product and expanding it into a new market that they haven't seen as well. So this is a new market strategy. And this one is more products. So the concept is what's known as penetration. And penetration just means, quite simply, you're going to sell more. So if I were looking at new customers, I would say one of the great ones that came up with this idea is Starbucks. So Starbucks had an existing market with an existing product. They took their existing products and they expanded out to new markets. Once they tightened up the brand itself. Now, what Starbucks did once they saturated the markets is they decided that they were going to start selling new products in their existing markets. And so you started to see them do things like take on records and music and all of those other kinds of things. And that's the way Starbucks has rolled. Penetration as it is just a quite simple way. You're just trying to find more people, more ways to do it. Of all of the strategies that you can come up with, the penetration strategy is the fastest. It does not require you to come up with new marketing strategies. You're just quite simply trying to find ways to get consumers to buy more. It doesn't require any new product strategy other than finding ways for consumers to come out there. Now, in the protecting of market strategy, one of those is what's called continuous innovation, and I will be talking about that in a minute. But I want to talk about the concept of proactive marketing first. So what proactive marketing basically states is that there are many times when quite simply the market is not going to grow any further. And so with proactive marketing, you have two things that you can do. One of them is called responsive anticipation. And this is quite simply when you decide that the market is no longer feasible for you to stay in, and you proactively innovate your way out of the market, if that sounds crazy. All right. So in 2001, IBM made the decision that they were no longer going to have an entry systems division, which means that they would no longer sell desktop PCs. The entire industry freaked out because for IBM to exit entirely out of the market, a big player like IBM, you can imagine the number one individual coming out of the desktop environment caused a lot of the stirring of the waters. Compaq and HP and all of those other brands were, kind of lapping it up, seeing with all the demand. But IBM had a process and idea. They saw themselves in the future growing out of that industry. And by 2010, IBM was the number one software maker in the world. It doesn't make sense, but it does, trust me, right? Because IBM's systems divisions had much more going on than besides the desktop PC world. In 2007, they sold their laptop division, ThinkPad, to Lenovo, which is the manufacturer that was making it at that time. And so if you have a Lenovo, in essence, you have the grandparents of the original IBM ThinkPads. And it was a great idea. It worked great for IBM. They were able to anticipate themselves out of the market, and they did it without losing a cent. Creative anticipation is where you react to changes with your own innovations, willing to stay in the market by, in essence, being willing to change with the market at the same time. So Microsoft had a foldable iPad-like system that they were ready to bring out in 2009, and it was called the Surface, okay? And what this particular item did is it was book size. So you would literally have it like this, and it would be folded like a book like this. You would open it up, you would work on the system like that, and it was going to be one of the anticipated products that they had coming out that was going to replace everything. Well, the problem with that is that there was a ground fight inside of Microsoft because Microsoft was afraid of losing, or Windows was afraid of losing market share to this. And the first question you should ask yourself is that if Microsoft saw themselves losing market share to this, then isn't it likely that they're going to lose market share to Apple? And they never asked themselves that question, and in essence, missed that on the biggest hardware expansion in the history of electronics. So there's like I said, if you're not putting yourself out of business, someone else will, all right? So before I go on to this, I want to come here, and there's a particular paper that I would like you to look at. And let me turn off my sharing. And turn on this one. so this paper was in the Journal of Marketing in 1967, and it was one of the core seminal articles that was ever written. In the 60s in marketing, you had what were known as thought pieces. And so a thought piece was just not necessarily something that was derived not only from theory, but had practical experimentation as well. This was derived from theory, but brought up as a concept or an idea of way of thinking. If you read this article, it will help you, especially in the next 3 chapters. So this article was written by a gentleman by the name of Thomas Robertson. And one of the things that he talked about was innovation was a concept that was entirely alien, different, and independent from innovation, an invention. And I want to hammer this to you as well. Innovation is not invention. They are 2 different animals explicitly. So I've read this book by Shumter, and it is a brilliant concept and understanding of what innovation is. Shumter says that innovation is characterized by construction of new plants and equipment, production of new firms, and the rise of leadership of new people. Innovation is what he calls a discontinuous event. And what a discontinuous event is a means that everything changes. Not just it changes in doing something easier, but your lives change substantially in one way or another. All of a sudden, there are new leaders that are out there doing things. There's new plant and equipment that is being built. People are shifting their ideas and thinking in a whole new way. I've been through 4 or 5 of those in my personal lifetime, starting with PCs, going to the internet, cryptocurrencies. All of those are what smartphones, all of those that would be considered discontinuous events. And this is what innovation means. Innovation, from the anthropologist H.G. Barnett said, is that it is any thought, any behavior, or anything that is qualitatively different than existing forms. And it's important to mention that as qualitative is a very esoteric idea. Innovation is any idea that is perceived as being new or different from the individual. The book leans very heavily on this article. So if you read this, you'll be reading it straight from the individual who came up with the idea. And so this article describes the process that innovation, as it comes up, and its processes what it does, and ultimately what it says is how is innovation used as well. And so I'll just leave that for you to read, and I will reference it back and forth. So let's talk about the 3 different types of innovation. Now, you won't find this slide, by the way, in the traditional slides in this book. I pulled these slides out of somewhere else, but these slides do an excellent job of explaining it. And yes, this is what will be on the test. There are 3 ideas that we have about innovation, and they are known as continuous, dynamically continuous, and discontinuous. Okay. After this, we'll take a break and we can return back to this. Okay. So let's talk about them. We'll start with the least. A continuous innovation is just a modification of an existing product. Usually, this is the most common form of innovation, and this can definitely be a marketing strategy. If you look at Samsung's innovations are generally continuous events because they are planned to come out every 6 to 8 weeks of some kind of new innovation in a particular item that they have. Now, they also might have, some major changes as well, especially now with the flex phones. The cameras, those different things tend to be continuous in innovation themselves. They tend to be minor modifications, even though they may have more dramatic results. But you might find those to be the most common. Knockoffs usually come from that, but knockoffs are usually those that copy somebody else's item, and then with a slight modification, they bring those out. And so it is not surprising when you started to see iPads come out and then Androids. I started doing a little hobby. I started collecting $40 Android tablets just to see how they work. And expensive hobby. But I started looking at them and seeing how they work. And the Android operating system is the same as the Android operating system on every one of them. But what I did find, and of course, we all know, well, my general assumption is that the one thing that the iPads have is they have that uncompromising screens that are just absolutely beautiful. Only Samsung, in my own mind, matches those. But knockoffs work, okay? Knockoffs are not continuous innovations in and of themselves. They're just out there to pull those particular items or things that they like and then use them on a different platform, okay? A dynamically continuous innovation is a pronounced modification of an existing product. It is not unusual for a dynamically continuous innovation to become a discontinuous one. So, somebody name to me the things that you can do with your phone. Text, all right. What else? Calls, yeah. Oh. What else? Take pictures. What else? Order food. Okay, what else? Web browse. Web browse. What else? What's that? Alarm, yes.
And pay for goods and services now.
Yeah, pay for goods. Okay. Games. Yep. Navigation. You bet, man. I've been lost without going through Iceland, I'm telling you, and Stockholm too. Okay, what else? Calculator. Okay. What else? Music. You did it. None of you have watches. Or do you have a watch? Okay. Why? What else can this thing do? Tell time. Yes. Yes. The thing that we have one of ours. If any of you chooses Swatch, it's one of my favorite cases. Anything else? Anything else? Just right off. Okay, this is plenty because this does a lot of what I wanted to talk about. The smartphone was not like an idea that kind of coalesced and sprung from the mind of Zeus Arm ready for battle. It was one of those things that was generated over time because what you found is that with a single identifiable platform using a processor that could be programmed and reprogrammed, and that's what all software languages do, that you could actually have it do more things. So you started out with a smartphone that you could text and do phone calls. And then you realize, Philip Kahn came out with the webcam in 1997, and somebody put a camera on it, and they started taking pictures. Well, then, if you're able to order those things, and you've got an online operating system, and you're already ordering things online of computers, it's not going to take long before you find some ways of being able to do those same things on the phone. And the fact that it's mobile, all of a sudden everything blows up in the middle, and it means that you can carry it around wherever you can go. And if you carry it around wherever you go, guess what? It's got a GPS system, and now all of a sudden you can use it for navigation. All of these things grown together is what's called a dynamically continuous innovation. It's also known as disruptive technologies as well. It's when you see this clash of machinery that hits each other and changes things. And it's also a concept known as convergence, where you have two or more technologies coming together and building into something that has never been done before. And so that's an example. The final one is known as a discontinuous innovation. And a discontinuous innovation is a product that changes everything. It changes the way we live. One of the ways that you know that you're looking at a discontinuous innovation is if in the new product information, the first thing that they do is they come out with education. They tell you how to use it, okay? That's the first key. If it is so unique and different that you don't understand it. When microwaves came out, one of the first things that you saw in microwave commercials was how to use it. And of course, back then they thought that you could cook meat in it. And, you know, turns out you could make leather saddlebags out of meat real quick in a microwave. But all of that was like its way of learning how to use it and how it ultimately was going to create it. So as I've said, in my lifetime, PCs, the internet, which if you look at it in the 90s, especially with CompuServe and you talk about AOL, I remember in 1983 when VidText came out, and VidText was using a 300 baud motor, all right? And it had the sound couplers and that kind of thing. And when you started to get football scores live, it just blew me away. I realized where the final end of this was going to be. Certainly the internet is one. Cell phones, because cell phones have changed everything as well. Cryptocurrencies, I'll talk about cryptocurrencies and I'll talk about non-fungible tokens. I'm doing research on that and I think it's so important for you to know because this is your future, it's not mine. But a discontinuous innovation changes things. It changes things forever so that nothing is the same, all right? And so these are the levels of innovation as they are and ultimately how things are processed. So let's take a quick 10-minute break. I ran a little long, I'm just having too much fun. Let's come back at about 12:50. And I'm not in a hurry to try to get this chapter all done. We've got 3 chapters in 4 days. So I'm going to roll with it, okay? Okay. So let's take 10 or whatever, and we'll come right back at, well, 12:32. We'll come back at 12:45. Okay.
That's the bargaining side.
So somebody is the bargain master?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my
finance
liaison.
class.
Right.
Yes. That's how I knew when I was in banking school. That's when I knew he was the leader.
Thank you.
Don't worse.
Would fire be considered a continuous innovation?
What?
Fire?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. There's nothing, everything changed after that.
Okay, all right, that's what.
The wheel, you know.
Like,
Yeah, I'll give you one, the automobile. Now, the interesting thing about the automobile is that the automobile was developed in the 1880s. So, I mean, it's been around for a long time. It came out of the internal combustion engine. But it did not become a discontinuous innovation until Henry Ford came along and changed it profoundly when he made automobiles affordable for everyone in the United States. So when the Model T came along, So when the Model T came along, Henry Ford had a vision. Henry Ford wanted to make it affordable for anyone in the United States to be able to afford one. This was 1905, 1906. And for him, the market or the Mendoza line was $500 because $500 was the average income of the average worker in the United States in 1905, 1906. Now, he was driven by that, so he had to find or come up with a way of making the car affordable, all right? So one of the things that he did was he called on the Dodge brothers. I don't know if you knew this, but Henry Ford failed twice. He had 2 bankruptcies, and he was wanting to be able to produce this, and he quite simply couldn't do it on his own. And so John and Horace Dodge, I think that's what their names, they came up with ideas and concepts to make it less expensive, like putting the steering wheel on the right-hand side before that steering wheel was in the middle. Coming up with brakes, coming up with the way of starting the system, the sparking environment. A lot of innovations came from the Dodges. So that was one of the things he did. The next thing he did was he studied standardized parts. So standardized parts came in around the 1850s when we were out there having rifles out in the wars. And one of the things that standardized parts meant is that you could take broken weapons and take the pieces apart and come and put them together and have another workable weapon. Before that, the parts were unique unto themselves. They were match items, and one bolt from one weapon couldn't fit another. Well, when you come up with standardized parts, they can. The third thing that he did was he did not invent the factory. He did not invent the assembly line, but he saw the assembly belt. All right. So he went to the 1896 exposition in Chicago, and they had a slaughterhouse there. And what he noticed is that instead of people moving from one step to the next, what they were doing is staying where they are, and an assembly belt was moving the products. And so he took the assembly belt and he put that in his factories. And ultimately what that meant is that the individual workers would be much more efficient in the way that they work. And so instead of turning out 20 cars in a month, they turned out 2,000 in a month, first time. And the last thing he did was he paid his workers 10% above the regular price. They were making $9 a day, all right? And he paid them so that they could buy their own. Now, I'm going on about this, and I do that a lot. But what I want to tell you is, and the important part to realize about this is that Henry Ford didn't come up with the individual parts and come up with a brilliant idea. He had the idea first, all right? He had the vision and the goal to make a $500 automobile. And from then on, all of his other plans came from that. And that's what great planners do. They have the big dreams first, and then they figure out how to make it work, okay? All right, so in a situation where you especially are the number one individual in a group, there are several ways to be defending and protecting your market share. And this is what's known as defensive marketing. So the best is position marketing. And this is where you occupy the most desirable position. And this is by coming up with a unique brand and identifier that quite simply no one can copy. And I put Apple in this list. They live on the blue ocean. Their idea is that they quite simply swim only among themselves and no one else, all right? A flanking defense is when a marketed leader erects outposts to protect themselves, okay? In other words, they come up with a unique product or unique idea to take that idea away from somebody else before they come up with it themselves, okay? A preemptive defense is more aggressive, and that means to attack first. So when Microsoft was coming out with their brilliant idea, they could have preemptively taken the iPad out of the first position status by coming up with it first. I've talked about it enough. Let me see if I can come up with it very simply, quickly. Probably have a commercial. So that was, yeah, they've actually called it the same thing. Let's see, where was it? What was the original? Okay, that's not it. All right, I'll look it up because I don't want to have to sit here and go through it. I forgot what was the name of it, and I don't want to go on with it without getting to be more accurate. So the preemptive, okay, is basically coming out with a product first to detract the company from being the loss or the first leader. The counteroffensive is the attack, but afterwards. Okay. And so Coke, in their brilliant strategy in the 70s, when Pepsi was coming out with their taste tests, and they were saying that people preferred Pepsi over Coke, what Coke's brilliant strategy was to change the taste of Coke so that it could beat Pepsi. Anybody know how that worked out? Miserable. One of the great failures in marketing research was when Coke came up with this brilliant idea that they wanted to taste just like Pepsi. And as a loyal Coke drinker, yes, I would probably, in a blind test, prefer Pepsi because Pepsi is sweeter, all right? But Coke has this bitter part of the cocoa plant. I don't know if you knew that, it still has it. There's a bitter part of the cocoa plant and the cherry that Coke tastes or Coke drinkers prefer, believe it or not. We like that little bit of the bitter taste to it. And that's why Pepsi would go and win these tests, and it's driving the Coke people nuts. Pepsi, I tell you, if I could work for anybody, I'd prefer working for Pepsi rather than Coke instead of Coke, because quite simply, they had some pretty smart people. After 1993, 94, they decided that they weren't going to win the cola wars. And so what they did was they started branching off and doing other things. They bought Pizza Hut. They bought Long John Silver. They bought KFC. They bought Taco Bell. They started creating these fusion stores of two of these three together. They created an entire different group called WOW, and you can go look them up. And it has spun off onto its own system and can never be seen again. Gatorade was up for being bought, and Coke didn't even put in a bid, all right? Because they said, well, we have Powerade. You've got 15% of the market with Powerade. You could go after another 70% if you bought Gatorade. I mean, you didn't even put up a number. You could make Pepsi fight for it, okay? But they didn't. Anyway, I'm going. So These are strategies in defensive marketing. Okay, so counter. Mobile defense is where you stretch the domain into new territories. And so one of the great things, and you can also think of this in diversification. So when Starbucks had filled up in terms of the number of markets they could have in the United States and filled up their stores with practically everything they could squeeze in with a crowbar, what you started seeing was they started coming out with products that could be found in grocery stores. And that's an example of diversification. And so they started putting together prepackaged Starbucks coffees, the cold drinks they started having. I saw this and I thought, this is genius. So I went into the AutoZone, and at the exit counter, there was a small cooler and it was full of Starbucks stuff. And I thought to myself, how smart it is to think beyond your perceptions of people who go into auto stores and consider that they drink that stuff too. And I thought that was a brilliant idea. And so this is another way, a mobile, because you're basically taking that product area before anyone else is. And the last is contraction, which means quite simply is you advance towards the rear. So in other words, you're getting out. Because no army ever retreats, they advance towards the rear, okay? You can't defend the territory anymore. In a planned trend, that area you give up a weaker market, you reassign resources so that sometimes it goes somewhere else. So an example of this is Procter & Gamble. Anybody want to guess how many laundry detergents they have? You're close, 11. Okay. Yeah, they have 11 laundry detergents. Think yourself, laundry. How many different ways can you do it? 11 ways. They had Oxydol at one time. Oxydol was the #1 brand in the 50s. Oxydol was the sponsor for every daytime story in the United States from 1950 to 1975. That's why they're called soap operas, because they were sponsored by Oxydol, okay? In 1976, Procter & Gamble came out with Gain, and they sold Oxydol to another corporation. You can still get Oxydol on the shelves, but it's a classic example of contraction, getting out of that market completely, and that's why they've moved on to other things. Okay, yeah, Oxydol was like #1. So these are strategies for protecting your share. The first strategies were how to grow the overall market. This is how you protect. Now you got to ask yourself, is there any bad side for attacking my competitors? Well, yeah, because you have the problem of marginal returns. You might actually bite off more than you can chew, and you can have difficulties in increasing your market share, especially when it affects your own individual quality. And that's really one of the big difficulties. AT&T was going to buy T-Mobile. This was 10 years ago. And the FCC said that it would create invoke the Sherman Antitrust Act, in that it would create an effective monopoly in the communications industry. And so they took advantage of that a little bit. Also, the economic costs of trying to be able to take over one corporation. One of the really bad mergers that ever happened was between Compaq and Hewlett-Packard. That increase of the market share meant a decided disadvantage ultimately when it came to the quality of both Compaq and Hewlett-Packard. All right. And the other difficulty also is pursuing growth for the sake of itself. Sometimes it creates tunnel vision. You can't see your way out of it. all right? And so many times you have to ask yourself, am I doing this in the right way? Every company goes through this when they go from, I have my own theory about things. Every company starts as a mission, then it becomes a production, and the last is it becomes a racket, all right? And that mission to production stage, if you keep the mission in your life and in your work, it always spurs you on to do great things. And you can think in your own mind, companies that have gone through this phase right now, and that happens especially when growth is just merely for growth's sake, that you give up something in the acquiescence and the acceptance of other things. And so what we try to push or understand is that there's an optimal market share in the middle there somewhere, that there's the best place or the most ideal place for most corporations to live, and they're happy with it. So how much of the total desktop market does Apple own? Without looking up. 8. Yeah, Apple owns 8% of the market, the desktop market. The highest that they ever had was 13%, and that was in the 90s when they were licensing their licenses to other corporations to make Macintosh clones. And Apple's dominant reason for living has never been about market share, all right? And if they ever get to that point, and you can see a little bit of that, not in the PC, the desktop environment, but you can see it kind of in their phone division, and then I think they lost something very substantial and important. There's an optimum there, all right? I mean, the average gross margin, or let's say net profit, that desktop systems have is 6%, okay? So that means that a desktop or a laptop that sells for $1,000, after all their bills are paid, the manufacturer makes $60. Macintosh is 40%. How can they do that? Because that is the value that consumers perceive, all right? That is where brand equity and brand loyalty exists, and that consumers are willing, more than willing, to spend that in order to obtain what they want, all right? So there is the secret of Apple's success. And so we talked about those protective strategies. Well, what can the challenger do? The challenger is like one step above, all right? They just want to get up there in one way or another. Well, how do they do it? Well, they got to beat up somebody. So it depends on whether they're punching up or punching down. It's either one or the other. So they can either attack the market leader. They can look at firms that are their own size, but can't take the long-term pressure. And so when those firms go out of business, they take over that. They can look at small local and regional firms and try to go after their market, but there's a danger there, a big one. And then finally, they can attack just the status quo, the general acceptance of a given market at one time. Now, the problem with attacking local and regional firms is quite simply, local and regional firms have local and regional fans. And there are people who like those particular corporations and they want to stay in business. When Walmart started its growth in the 80s, they were opening a new store every 6 weeks. And they did that for a period of about 8 years, I think, is it. Walmart is the number two or number 3 real estate owner in the United States next to the federal government. I think McDonald's is number 3, something like that. Anyway, one of the things that they did, which became one of their banes, is the fact that they took a lot of business away from local and regional companies. Quite simply, they couldn't compete. One of the things that Walmart was doing in that time is, if you open a new store, you can sell goods at below cost. And not only can that store sell goods below cost, but all of the participating stores can sell those same goods below cost as well. And the key behind that is that can only go on for 8 weeks. So what it meant to us is that Walmart for years was selling goods below cost. Now, they couldn't continue it forever. It had, I think, 2 to 3 years was the cap on it. But that was one of the things that they were able to do, and that made them from a challenger to shoot past Kmart and eventually become number 1. And now they're the leader. And guess who's nipping at Walmart's heels? You want to guess? And this little terrier won't let go, and Walmart can't figure out how to beat it. No, close. Dollar General. There's 18,000 Dollar Generals in the United States, and they're only in 38 states. And the Dollar Generals have got this great idea. They don't put their Dollar Generals in cities, but between cities. And it's not unusual when you think about it, but they put them in drive locations outside of major areas. And so if you look at the Dollar General that's going towards Wilkesboro, it's on the right-hand side, okay, on the way out of town. The Dollar General going towards Tennessee, where is it? It's on the right-hand side on the way going out of town. They came up with a great idea. Walmart tried to come up with these small customizable stores that were around the same size. Couldn't figure out how to do it. It's just really bad, okay? So that's one of the ways that you can do it. That's a great strategy. And Dollar General has done something that Walmart has decided they can't do. They came up with an idea. If you go to Dollar General, it is 80% of all the goods that you can find in a Walmart in a reasonably small store. And one of the smartest things that they ever did, where do you find breakfast food in the Dollar General? Like milk and eggs, where do you find it?
As soon as you walk in.
As soon as you walk in, where do you find the milk in a Walmart?
Very bad.
In the very back, exactly. So you're gonna walk all that way, you're gonna walk all the way back. Dollar General put it in the front, clever way of doing it. So they attack the market leader with a product that's so unique and different that Walmart can't figure out what to do with these little terriers, okay? The other ways is that you go after underfunded size firms of your own size. Family Dollar and Dollar General have been in this fight, and I think Dollar General bought the Dollar Tree, okay? And so now it's down to 2 corporations that are hammering it out. Yes?
Dollar Tree bought Family Dollar.
I said, I'm sorry, you got it. I flipped around. Thank you. Yes, yes. Family Dollar had a great, but the problem is they were fighting against a bigger corporation than they were, Dollar General, that can more than handle it. So Dollar Tree found their way to get into that. And so the rest, as we say, is history. All right. So in order to do challenging, all right, you have to come up with attack strategies. And so these are market challenger strategies as ways of fighting and punching up through the competition. And so the strategic objective of every market challenger is to become a market leader. And so all of these strategies have to do with attacking the leader so that you, in essence, can become the leader in and of yourself. The principal rule of force says that the side with the greater resources will win. That is a general statement. And if you're doing a frontal attack directly on the market leader, it is a difficult one, all right? You attack by product, advertising, distribution, price. You come up with new ways of delivering the goods that the market leader doesn't have. You come up with different effective advertisements. This is in essence what Target has done to their effectiveness, so much so that people do not put in their minds as a Walmart or Target is challenging each other. Target has been really amazingly adept at being able to make themselves unique from Walmart. So the flanking attack is you basically try to come up with different ways of doing the same things and you create shifts in the market. Okay. And so flanking attack, an example of this is buy online, pick up in store. Okay. Which became a very unique situation. So when online and omni-channel came around, one of the effective, real discouraging things was the concept that retail as a strategy would go away forever. And by retail, what I mean is a storefront and a store location would go in and get goods. However, what we found is that while all of this was going on, especially during the pandemic, we found that there was another difficulty that we were having, and that was with delivery. And so one of the difficulties that went on, especially in the recessionary period, is that there weren't enough people employed doing those same goods with a significant increase in delivery. It meant that consumers were having to find some other way to get the goods to them. And so we're not going to ship a pizza by mail. And so if I have to wait an hour for the pizza delivery guy, how many of you went to go pick up the pizza by yourself? Yeah, okay. Well, that's buy online, pick up in store. It was a whole new strategy that came up just because of consumers doing something different. And we found this also happening in the Walmarts and the regular retail stores. You buy it online, you put it on release, and you go into the store and pick it up yourself. It represented an entirely different way of doing things. Now, the difficulty is that buy online, pick up in store became 15% more expensive for the store because you had to get somebody to pull those goods and put them somewhere. So what would I do? What would you do if you had people coming into your store to pick up goods that they already bought? What would you try to do if you were a store?
Have them go pick it up themselves.
And what would you want them to do when they came in the store? What's that?
Buy even more stuff.
Yes, exactly. Get them to buy more stuff. And so what you found is that when they got there, they would say, oh, by the way, there's a 15% coupon if you buy anything else at this time. Okay. So that's one of the ways the strategy worked. It was confusing. Walmart, greatest distribution channel in the world, they picked up on it. Other corporations kind of stumbled out of the gate. Target, one of them, but it worked and it was wildly successful. Encirclement. Encirclement means you come up with just so many different ways, and it with a grand offensive with so many different delivery options that are not preconceivable, that you basically encircle the market leader to where they have no room to come out with some new innovations. The next is that you just basically go on to other products or other unrelated possibilities. So Tesla is one of the greatest bypass attacks on the automobile industry in the world because of one thing, and it comes down to their service departments. Tesla is the only corporation or automobile corporation in the United States that doesn't publish a parts catalog. Every other corporation does. If you want to go to an AutoZone, look up the parts, you can find them, but you can't find Teslas. In order to be able to get a Tesla worked on, you got to be able to be a Tesla customer, all right? And is that to their good or their bad? It's a good question. Teslas, by their nature, have 40% fewer parts than every traditional automobile. And service departments traditionally make more than 50% of the net profit of any automobile dealership. So it's a totally different paradigm shift in the way that we buy and service automobiles. So the answer is I don't know. I'm going to be very curious to see what the secondhand market is on electric vehicles, like in the next 5 or 10 years, or if there is one, because I see a big brouhaha coming over liquid lithium batteries, at some point. I find interesting, by the way, in electric vehicles, Toyota's never come out with an EV, not yet. All right, they come out with plug-ins and they come out with hybrids, but I'm betting on Toyota to come up with the killer technology. All right. Finally, is guerrilla attacks, intermittent, brushing attacks, selective price cuts, intense promotional blitzes, even legal action. Okay, so one of the things that Apple did to Samsung makes 3 of the major chips that are in the Apple iPad. And yet Steve Jobs attacked Samsung for what he called unfair business practices against them. Wow, yeah, whatever you think. So, market leader, market challenger, we're going to talk about market followers, and we're going to talk about market nichers, and we're going to wrap this up and we're going to go. So market follower strategies basically is what it sounds like. You follow the leader. You allow the major companies to bear all of the costs when it comes to developing the market. You allow them to be the lost leaders. But what you try to do is you try to come up with one unique thing that you can do, like location or services. And so there's a healthy market right now in repairing iPad screens, a very healthy market, okay? Because basically iPads are factory sealed. You can open them up if you're crazy enough. One of the reasons why I got out of the industry, because I was a PC person for 25 years, I told you that, is quite simply I couldn't see it. I mean, the stuff was so small now. My vision just wasn't what it used to be. I was used to working on big machines, and the laptops got smaller and the iPads got smaller. Anyway, so the follower basically follows those around. And so there's 3 strategies when it comes to that. The cloner emulates the leader's products, their names, their packaging with slight variations. And so we've seen these. If there are independent grocers, they're called IGAs, and they have their own lines of products that look closely like, okay, but not exactly like the leaders. And I'm trying to remember the store that's in Hickory. It's not Lidl. It's one of the other stores. But 85% of the things in their grocery stores are products of their brand's names. And they look close enough that if you didn't notice, you would think that they were there. So like the Dr. Pepper clone, it's called Dr. Pop, and the colors look close, but not close enough. And that's how cloners make it. Imitators, they do things that differentiate it from packaging and advertising and pricing. They differentiate it just enough that the leaders don't care. They tend to be a higher line. Samsung is, you would almost call them, in a way, something of an imitator. But an adapter takes the products and they improve them. All right. It may even sell in different markets. So in 1984, in 1983, IBM released their IBM PC, which was an incredible invention, changed things forever fundamentally. One of the great things about the IBM also was they published their IEEE standards. so that you could have manufacturers make goods for the IBM PC that were extra goods, like Seagate made hard drives for them, and Hayes made modems, and you saw Logitech make keyboards. These are some of the things that spurred on IBM. Well, in 1984, Rod Canyon of Compaq, instead of using the 8088 processor that IBM used the 8086, which had a full 16-bit memory path and processing path, which made them run everything that IBM did, but ran it 50% faster in a native mode. So in essence, as an adapter, they made a better machine, not just a copy or an imitation. And so that just kind of gives you an idea. There are many ways that you can follow. You can make them so close that you might make a mistake. You can imitate them. In other words, come up with a quality piece that has some of the same variety of things, but the leader doesn't care, or then you can adapt it and make it better. And Compaq is an example of doing that successfully.
So what's the difference between cloner and imitator?
So a cloner is somebody that almost gives away their deliberate self, or almost a deliberate self-loss of identity, all right? So in other words, they're as close as they possibly can without being, with being able to obviously tell the difference. An imitator actually comes up with a quality item that maybe have a few bells and whistles that are different, but aren't necessarily, or let's just say you can tell the difference between the items, okay? So if I looked at a Samsung Android tablet and I were looking at an iPad, I could tell they were different, but they function differently as well. But their purposes are pretty much the same. A cloner, you couldn't tell the difference. All right, that makes sense. Yeah, no problem. And then of course the adapter is the better, no doubt about it. So the last is the nicher, and the nicher is a corporation or an individual who wants to be a big fish in a small pond. All right. These individual locations, if you want to think of A&B, Appalachian beer is a great example. All of the craft beers that are around here are excellent ideas. They're leaders in small markets, and they have like low shares of the total market, but they're highly profitable in the areas in which they compete. They're very, very strong corporations. They do substantial business within the areas that they are. And it's very possible to see these nichers to be bought up by corporations and ultimately part of like an overall brand strategy. So an example is there was a coffee company in Southwest Louisiana called Mellow Joy. Sounds like something different, but it's not, it's coffee. Mellow Joy made a coffee and chicory in Southwest Louisiana. Everybody drank it. In the 50s, Mellow Joy was bought by Community Coffee, which is made in Baton Rouge. And in essence, they did away with the brand, all right? But they grabbed that substantial market. So here's a great story. So in order, if you buy a brand, every 10 years, you have to renew your rights to own that particular brand. So after 50 years of owning Mellow Joy, the lawyers at Community Coffee decided, or let's just say they forgot and they lapsed. The grandchildren of Mellow Joy bought the Mellow Joy brand back, brought it back to Lafayette and Lake Charles and those areas. And now it's the dominant brand of Southwest Louisiana. It's kind of a great revival story. And so anybody in Louisiana who drinks coffee knows Mellow Joy instead of Community Coffee. And this is an example of a market niche that was so strong and powerful that it couldn't die, that it brought itself back, okay? So you're either a leader, you're a follower, or you are a nicher, or you're an imitator or a follower, excuse me, leader, challenger, follower, niche, okay? So it's either one of those things. Now, the important thing that I want you to come to these lessons is that market strategy comes very much with your understanding of where you are in the world, all right? Who you are, what makes you up. And given those things, you have a series of rules that you try to live by, sometimes you don't. All right, we've finished our first day array. So I will be catching up with a lot of things. I'll catch up with the other tests. And if you have any questions or anything, email me. Great to see you. I'll see you tomorrow. So there's three brands. There's a hybrid, there's a plug-in, and an EV. A hybrid uses its batteries on takeoffs and stopping, so that the initial part that does the most driving, that eats up the most gasoline, the car doesn't do. A plug-in has batteries, and the batteries are charged, and the batteries can be used in commutal service for like, it's an EV up to 50 miles. And then when the batteries go down the quarter, it turns into a hybrid. A true electric vehicle has no internal combustion. What's that? Hasn't come out. They have a plug-in, but they don't have an EV.
Good enough. Thank you. See you tomorrow.
You bet.
Aaron, I have a question.
Sure.
So